Welcome back to Right Now with Miss Steinbauer. In today's lesson, we are going to be talking about something called show, don't tell. Show, don't tell is a technique often used when you're writing fiction, and it's going to be useful for you when you're writing stories, narration, or anecdotes. To show means to use details, actions, and images to actually show us what's happening in a text rather than just tell us or explain it directly. And the reason you want to use this technique is because it creates a much more immersive and dynamic writing experience. When you show us rather than tell us, you make the readers feel like they're actually there in that moment, experiencing it for themselves. And it's going to end up making your writing more convincing. So first of all, let's take a look at some examples. Here's an example of telling. The party was fun. It's very plain and direct. It might get the point across, but it's not all that convincing or necessarily easy to grasp or understand. Now let's take a look at how you could portray this statement through showing. We danced until midnight, then shared stories and laughed into the early hours of the morning. There's a very different effect between these two examples. Even though they convey the same idea, the second example is much more immersive because it's putting us in the scene and actually showing us what happened and how it felt to be at that party. It makes the idea more convincing, and it makes the situation seem that much more real and more developed. So let's talk about how you can use showing in your writing. In this lesson, I'm going to talk about 4 tips that you can use to show rather than tell. The first tip is don't label emotions. If you simply write, I felt sad, or I felt scared, that's a pretty good clue that you're telling rather than showing. So instead of labeling those emotions directly, try to describe how those emotions felt, what they looked like, how they sounded, what they smelled like or tasted like. You can think about your 5 senses and see if you can describe that emotion through those. The second tip is to set the scene. Setting is very important in any story. And instead of just telling us that a place is scary or creepy, for example, you could show us why it's scary or creepy. So looking at this picture here, instead of saying it was a scary house, you could describe the darkness or the fog or the cobwebs hanging off the roof or maybe the crows flying around at night. Anything that you can use to actually immerse us within that scene. Here's another example of a telling statement. My dad was very upset. Again, this is an example of labeling the emotion. One way you could get around this is by using imagery and concrete details. So here's an example of how you could inject a little bit of life into that statement. A vein began to bulge out of my dad's forehead. The color of his face turned purple. The chair beneath him began to squeak as he shuffled uncomfortably. I gripped the legs of the table, firmly forcing splinters into my skin, and held my breath. So there's a lot more going on in this statement versus my dad was angry. You can actually see what he looks like. You can imagine what it sounded like in the room or what this character felt like as they were kind of bracing their dad's eruption at his anger. And the last tip is to use action words. So here's another example. He threw his fork down onto his dinner plate, splattering gravy all over the kitchen table. Here, the action words threw his fork down and splattering gravy inject life into the sentence. He didn't just gently place it down. He threw it down hard enough that it actually caused the gravy on his plate to splatter all over. So by using really strong, active words, you can show us what's happening. Okay, it's your turn to practice. I'd like you to pause the video and see if you can take this telling statement, "Her room was messy," and turn it into a showing one. Try to use all of the tips that we just discussed in the lesson. Okay, how did you do? Did you use some action words? Did you use imagery and concrete details? Did you try to set the scene for us in order to show us what it was like inside that room? Hopefully you did that. One last thing to note. Telling phrases are often too vague, and they make the reader ask questions. However, all pieces of writing do need telling statements. Telling is not necessarily bad, and there are certainly going to be times when you need to be straightforward and direct. So it's up to you. You must determine the best time to tell and when to show in your writing. That's all for this lesson. Go out and do some showing, not telling, and have a great time writing.